focusing on is how to use AI to minimize harm. So my name is Jakobson, and as I was just introduced, I am an ethics researcher and consultant. I work across academia, and I am also a practitioner at the University of Cambridge and Principia Advisory. While I have heard quite a bit of chatter on the first day and this morning about that ethics is important in this field, what I wanted to do is to really focus in on this question, what is ethics? As I see it in such a way that there is still quite a lot of misconceptions, quite some confusion. What does it actually mean? And I think we can see this when we consider the wider sector and see just how little actually ethics is implemented. So I wanted us to turn to that to take some key takeaways for feeling good to have these conversations in the future and to start implementing. While I will give you a high-level overview, what I'm not able to do this afternoon is to give you a lot of detail and depth due to the session, but I hope that we can be taking this offline afterwards. So please do ask any questions during the Q&A or later. So now let's start with my quick and dirty overview of all the aspects of AI ethics. And so what I will be doing today is, at first I will be starting with what is AI ethics. Then we will be turning to thinking through why it matters and why we should be really taking it seriously. And then thirdly, I want us to address the very difficult question of how can we start implementing it. And for that, I will give you a sense of where to start. I will also give you some guidelines and I will give you some principles. And then I will also give you a tool that you can take away to start implementing ethics this very day. So let's start off by getting us all onto the same page and think through at first what ethics actually isn't, in order for us to talk about what it is. So, in my work, I have frequently encountered that people think of ethics in a very similar way to PR or communications. Well, let me tell you that this is actually not what it is, because PR is associated with polishing the outside without really doing much on the inside. But this is not really what ethics is, because what we want to do is to really go deep inside and to do the work that sets us up, and not just to polish or do ethics washing in a way people refer to greenwashing companies. So secondly, I want us to turn towards busting the myth of that ethics is actually legal or compliance, something I also very frequently encounter in my work. And so while law is really a rules that will govern something that is legally binding, this is not what ethics is. Ethics comes into place after we have a legal framework. And it really helps us navigate decision-making processes and dilemmas. And I will come to that in a second. So some might also think that ethics is actually not that helpful because it is just so pluralistic. There are so many different theories out there, from virtue theories to consequentialism to utilitarianism, and that therefore it is simply a process just of subjectivity. However, let me say to that what you think is a drawback of ethics is actually a strength that we can harness for the purpose of artificial intelligence. As we ethicists have actually many different tools available to us to help you with your set of specific problems in specific contexts. So lastly, what I want us to turn to is to the idea that actually ethics is hindering innovation, that it is slowing down the very fast progress that technology has to do. Well, to that, I would like to say that this is also a wrong way of conceiving of ethics, because ethics, when done right and when done well, actually helps and strengthens and gets us to a step towards innovation and not a step away from it. So now let's turn to some of the points of what ethics is in the context of artificial intelligence. It is a tool for asking some of the most fundamental questions that are out there, from what artificial intelligence is, to how we should be using it, as well as to when we actually shouldn't use it. Ethics is also a method for creating robust and reliable frameworks to operationalize how to consistently do the right thing, how to be proactive and not reactive, and how to navigate dilemmas and ethical trade-offs, so as to surface some risks and unintended consequences. So what we really want to do is to build a safer, fairer, and more inclusive world by means of ethics. So to just quickly recap where we are, I hope to have shown you that ethics isn't just a set of old books that are dusty and that some old man do in some university library far, far away, but that it is in fact something that we can utilize in order to strengthen the frameworks that we have, in order to make decisions now that will help us in the future. So with this in mind, now that we have laid the foundation, of clarifying what AI ethics is, let us move on to asking why it matters, why I or you or hopefully anybody else for this matter should take it seriously. So, to do that, let's start by considering one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy, namely that of the trolley problem. For those of you who are not familiar with it, let me give you a very quick overview. There is a trolley that you can see on the slide, and it is hurtling down the tracks. But on those tracks, there are actually 5 people tied down to those tracks. You're the person who finds yourself at this lever, and you have the power to pull the lever. And when you pull the lever, what will happen is the trolley will be diverted onto the one person that is tied down to the track. But when you're doing this, you will kill the one. So let me ask you to consider, would you pull the lever? Would you kill one in order to save 5? And if you would or you wouldn't, what are the reasons for doing so? What are the factors that would influence the decision that you're making? And would you want that everybody else in the same situation is making the same decision? For those of you not familiar with this thought experiment, you might be wondering, why is she talking about this hypothetical scenario when you have come here to learn more about the ethics of AI? So what we actually do within philosophy is that we take thought experiments because they're an opportunity for us to look more closely at how and for what reasons we are solving an ethical dilemma one way rather than another. So let us apply this now to a specific situation or our impending future, which is namely self-driving cars. So the 2 pictures that you can see on this slide have been taken from the MIT Brilliant Moral Machine. And I very much urge you to have a look at this. The URL is included on the slide. And it is a platform for gathering human perspectives on moral decisions made by machine intelligence, such as self-driving cars. So what this slide is showing you is a moral dilemma, where a self-driving car must choose the lesser of 2 evils. In the example on this slide, you will need to choose whether to kill the people in the left, and in this case it is a male doctor, a female executive, a boy, and an elderly woman. Or you can choose to divert the car and kill the pedestrians who are crossing the street at a red light, whether you would want to kill them instead. The people you'll be killing in this scenario would be 2 babies, a boy, a girl, and a homeless person. So what you can see here, if you're comparing it to the trolley dilemma that we just considered, it is no longer a question of whether to kill 1 over 5 or whether to interfere or not. But the trade-offs that we are now have to make are much more complex than what we previously considered. So what we have thrown in here is a question of gender, age, socioeconomic status, and legal considerations. So ask yourself again, what is it that you would want the self-driving car to do, and why? While self-driving cars aren't yet a reality that many thought that it would be by the time it's 2020, a self-driving car has already killed a pedestrian in March 2018 during test drives. So while many technologists actually think that the solution to this is to have more data to train autonomous vehicles, I want to stress that what we also need to do is to pay close attention to the moral considerations of these situations. And this isn't just true for the advances of artificial intelligence when it comes to self-driving cars. But these are really tough questions, as I hope you have realized at this point. So what we need to do is we need to harness the knowledge and the experience of ethicists in order to help us navigate the way towards a safer future. So, however, self-driving cars aren't the only problem that we are facing in artificial intelligence, and not even the only problem of life and death. There are many areas worth highlighting, But for the sake of this very short talk, I have decided to include 3 examples. So what we see here is we have an example of autonomous systems, such as lethal weapons. A lot of people are concerned about biases and discrimination, such as when it comes to predictive policing, and privacy and surveillance when it comes to questions such as facial recognition. And I guess that some of you who have been tuning in might be wondering at this point, hang on, I am not dealing in such artificial technology. I am not dealing in lethal weapons and nothing as controversial or with such fatal consequences. Maybe you might be even thinking that what you're doing is harmless or neutral. However, to that I would like to respond that every application of AI, no matter how seemingly harmless or neutral, will have some ethical gray areas that need to be addressed. And we can address this by asking certain questions. For example, what are the risks of harm? What is the impact on different communities? Who's going to take responsibility? And who's going to be accountable when things go wrong? And while some of the applications I have listed here seem to be unstoppable at this point in time, I mean, who can imagine that facial recognition will go away? There was a point in time when we had the opportunity to choose whether to do it or not. So on that note, I would like you to consider, just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean that we should. So to summarize the question of why AI ethics matter, let me say that AI ethics matters because the way we train AI has tremendous consequences. It can be a question of life and death, but it doesn't have to be. It affects different stakeholders, and we have also learned that vulnerable communities are affected disproportionately more. And AI can also infringe on some of the most fundamental human rights that we have. So what should we do in light of the weight of the decisions that we are making, especially where there seem to be so many options and not one right answer? So how can we ensure that we are building, will bring about a world that is safe, just, and equal? Well, we need to ensure that the AI systems that we are building make decisions on ethical grounds, and that the purpose that we are putting into these machines are the purpose that we actually want. So this is bringing me to the final question for the day, which is also by far the most difficult question I can tell you, namely, how can we start implementing AI ethics? So what I wanted to do is to start with the question of where should we start? And to this, I would recommend a 3-level approach, namely the organizational level, development and deployment, in order to harness the full potential of ethics. And while many tech companies from Facebook to Google to DeepMind to Microsoft to IBM, you name it, have dedicated ethics teams, it is important to think of ethics in a holistic manner rather than an isolated cog detached from the larger wheel. So with this in mind, let's look at the first level, namely the organizational level. And that level you should really think about in terms of as being the foundational level that feeds into all the other points. So what is important here is the people and systems you have in place in your company across different divisions. What ethics can help us with here is establish and maintain a culture that brings about ethical decisions, surfaces gray areas, to hopefully successfully navigate complex trade-offs. So moving on to the second one, what we want to think on the stage of development is really how can we train engineers and designers who are actually going to build AI going forward. And what we want to teach those employees is really how to use and utilize ethical frameworks aligned with the values and purposes a company has, which we can obviously do on an organizational level to establish this, as well as how to mitigate harm and the impact on people. Obviously, a better approach would be to think how to use AI for good, but this is a question that I will leave to my colleagues who will be speaking at a later stage. So let's come to the last point, namely the question of deployment. So when it comes to the ethics of deployment, really what we want to do is ideally to think through what is a product after it has been released into the world. Because even if we have an ethical organization and we're training our engineers, a product can still be used not with the intentions that it initially has been designed. So at this stage, what we really want to do is we want to use principles of ethical use in order to prohibit unintentional uses. And what we then also have to do is to systematically monitor the use of a product going forward. So the next question would be not just where do we start implementing, but what do we start implementing? And here my response is we will need to think about ethical frameworks. And there are a lot of different ethical frameworks out there that have been published, particularly in recent years. And I have included one among many I could have introduced. So another one would be the Toronto Declaration, focusing on human rights, might be the IEEE, or even the data ethics guidelines recently updated by the UK government for public sectors, in case you're working in that sector. And every one of these frameworks has some benefits, but also some drawbacks. And unfortunately, the scope of this talk is not enough in order to go into why we should choose one rather than the other, how we're choosing it, and how we're implementing it. But just to give you a sense and a flavor for what an ethical framework is, let's look at the one that I have been choosing for today, which is the AI Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI by the European Commission's high-level expert group, which was published in April 2019. And according to those guidelines, trustworthy AI should be three things. It should be lawful, it should be ethical, and it should be robust. And the 7 specific principles that they are mentioning are as follows. One is human agency and oversight, which is really a point on human autonomy and decision-making. One is on technical robustness and safety, and really a principle on preventing harm. One is on privacy and data governance, and privacy is specifically a fundamental right that AI is particularly concerned with, as well as transparency, something that we should be seeing on a level of data, on systems, as well as the business model, diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. So we really want to ensure that the products we are building are inclusive and diverse, and this is throughout the whole life cycle of a AI system. Then we also have societal and environmental well-being. This is a point that I particularly like, as this is often absent from other guidelines. And there we want to think about other sentient beings and the environment as a stakeholder throughout the AI system's life cycle. And then lastly, we have accountability, which is also a principle much concerned with fairness, and one of my favorite ones, as I think that it is particularly powerful. So now we've been talking about what to implement. The next question would be, how do we implement? Well, that is a very difficult question, I can tell you. And there are many different ways of starting. And one way, to be completely honest, would be to empower an individual or a team within your company to become ethics owners who can really drive the ethics in your company. An alternative way would be to employ an advisor such as myself, who is an expert on this topic, or the company that I work for. But as these are approaches with a lot of commitment behind them, I really wanted to leave you with a free, accessible, and easy tool for you to use today that you can just take away from here. So what you can see here, one of the examples that I've chosen, is the Ethical Explorer, which is a tool to help navigate the future impact of today's technology. And I've included the URL on this slide, so please do go ahead, download it. I am not affiliated with them, don't worry. This is not a marketing exercise. I just think it is a really good resource for you to start using. So what is it? The Ethical Explorer is a tool that you can use as an individual, but also as a team, and it will give you some guidance as to how to use this specific tool. And it has identified several tech risk zones, going from algorithmic bias to bad actors, disinformation, exclusion, addiction, outsized power, surveillance, and data control. And for each of these tech risk zones, it will give you a set of questions. And they're roughly divided into 3 categories. One is, where we stand on this subject? So there I've included for the algorithmic bias example of questions, but then it also moves on to anticipating risks, so it has specific questions for that, as well as questions on considering how to become a thought leader in this area. And I think this is a really great tool for you to start using with your team, just to get the conversation going and to experience firsthand of what it means to do ethics. So, to conclude, I wanted to give you some key takeaways. So we've asked these 3 questions. What is AI ethics? In a nutshell, we want to say it is a robust methodology for consistently doing the right thing, navigating ethical dilemmas and trade-offs, and surfacing risks. Why does it matter? Well, AI ethics creates concrete tools to build a future which is safe, equal, and just by addressing potential harms, aiming to protect vulnerable communities. And lastly, how do we start implementing? And there are different ways of doing this. But one way of starting is to use some of the existing ethical frameworks, tailor them to your company's needs, build them into your overall strategy, create a role for an ethics owner, both internal or external, and then train your employees to create clear lines of responsibility and accountability. So what I also realize is that I might have started this conversation with a few questions, and I have, in fact, left you with even more questions than I started. And you might also see that there are many problems that have now surfaced in discussing this. But while I don't want to leave you with just problems and questions, and a lot has been obviously left out, I hope what I achieved today was to give you a jump-off point to start this conversation, why to take ethics seriously and how to start implementing it. Thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you during the Q&A. And if you wanted to get in touch with me afterwards to continue this conversation, please see my contact details here. And it was a pleasure being here. Thank you, everybody.